Okay, good morning, guys. Today we're going to be talking about um, proposal development and writing for a general audience. The reason why this particular topic has come up specifically with our class internal awards, our review committee does a really good job of giving good feedback on not only just our processes, but the um, applicants in general. And one of the main critiques is that a lot of the proposals that they receive are generally kind of hard to follow because it's hard to understand just because of whatever that might be with jargon or just the flow of the proposal doesn't flow well. So that, and it's been consistent. It comes up quite often. Usually every grant cycle that we have, that's usually the main reviewer feedback that we get. So I kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit. I know I've done presentations in the past about how to prepare for writing your proposal and just general tips in writing the proposal. But I wanted to kind of focus a little bit more specifically on tailoring your proposal for a general audience. So, I am a quote person because I think everyone can sort of relate to quotes, but this is one of my recent favorites. Good writing will not save bad ideas, but bad writing can kill good ones. This is absolutely true. If the idea is bad, no amount of good writing will help it. But bad writing can turn the reviewer off quicker than, good writing with a bad idea. I've seen that in person myself. So you always want to be mindful of your approach and how you intend to keep the reviewer or the reader engaged. So just a little overview. We'll go over why it's important, a few examples, some best practices, and some resources for you guys to start bettering your writing, your proposal writing. So basically, the number one goal of your proposal is obviously to get funded, but you have to be able to drive your point to or your overall goal of your project to the reviewer and keep them engaged. And in order to do that, they have to be able to understand what you're actually writing. So this is why writing for a general audience is key, just because it makes it easier for people to understand your work. It also diversifies your writing skills. I mean, usually faculty members are used to academic writing, where it's more oriented in somewhat self promotion and scholarly pursuit. But when you're writing a grant proposal, you have to keep in mind that you're soliciting funds from a sponsor and they're trying to understand what their return on investment would be. But in order to do that, you have to keep in mind that reviewers come from a variety of fields. They might not necessarily be experts in your specific field. A lot of times, review committees are multidisciplinary. I know specifically with our review committee for our class internal awards, it is usually comprised of between 6 to 7 faculty members, but keep in mind, class has 13 departments, so they come from across that variety of disciplines, and so you have to keep that in mind. So when you write for a general audience, it kind of serves as a proposal that's written for a general audience, kind of serves as a catch-all to make sure that anyone would be able to understand what you're trying to explain. So Usually I tell people when I do proposal consultations, ask yourself, would others outside of my field be able to understand my proposal? Could I give this to my spouse, or could I give this to another colleague that's not really familiar with what I do? Would they be able to get through the proposal and fully comprehend it? Because people can read proposals, but you want people to be able to comprehend what they're actually reading. You also want to ask yourself, do certain words have multiple meanings? I know a lot of times when someone hears the word dating, they think about, mixing and mingling with other singles. But in a field specific to, let's say, geology, dating could deal with, different artifacts or things like that. So you want to be mindful of that. If the word has multiple meanings, you probably want to find an alternative word, or maybe not just use it at all. Um, and so also, you want to be very mindful of your use of acronyms, because I know, especially in with federal sponsors, there are acronyms galore just in the grant proposal preparation process. And I think NIH actually has this index of the different acronyms that they use. But you want to be mindful that reviewers might not be familiar with all the different acronyms that exist. So you definitely want to use jargon and acronyms sparingly. Why? Because it can distract and slow down the reader. If every other sentence there's a scientific term or a term that's specific to your field, if every other sentence I'm having to stop and try to decipher exactly what that means, that takes away valuable time from me actually comprehending what you're actually proposing. And there's been a couple of times when I've reviewed proposals where, they'll have technical terms littered throughout the proposal, and I've actually had to stop and Google what it actually means. So if you're going to use jargon, um, you need to decide specifically what terms are necessary to explain your research. And I mean, if there's no equivalent in the common language that you could use, that counts as maybe you need to use it. Just be sure that you're explaining what it actually is. And I think once you explain it the first time you use it, it's really no need to repeat it, more than a few times, because after that, it's repetitive. Um, and like I said, you want to try to limit your use to maybe 1 to 3 technical terms, just because you don't want your proposal to be littered with technical terms. So yeah. So you also want to avoid jargon that is confusing, that might be hard to pronounce. Um, if it offers little clarification, or if it could have multiple meanings, like I said earlier, chances are you probably want to find a word um, that's more commonly used that means the same thing as that, or definitely make sure that you're explaining exactly what it is. If it's absolutely necessary that you use it, you have to explain what it means. Again, you don't want your reviewers having to stop and Google what you're talking about. You definitely don't want that to happen, specifically because reviewers oftentimes, not only are they reading your proposal, but they're reading a multitude of proposals within a short time frame. And so their attention span they might not have, a lot of time allocated to each proposal. So just be very mindful of that. And also, you definitely want to define jargon that is named after a person. I see this countless numbers of times where, specifically with some of our social science proposals, or just science proposals in general, they might kind of get carried away talking about things and start talking about different syndromes, but they don't actually explain what that means. And again, I've seen this happen with proposals that are targeting, private foundations. Um, so you have to be mindful of that because a lot of times private foundations, yes, you might deal directly with the program officer and they might make recommendations about your proposal to, let's say, the board of directors. But a lot of times the board of directors aren't really experts in these types of fields. And so um, they have a little time allocated to each proposal. So don't make it difficult for them to try to understand what you're talking about. As you can see from the example here, it uses the specific term in the sentence, but it also explains what it is. And you want to avoid acronyms unless they are commonly used, like AIDS, CDC. Pretty much, that's kind of the average person pretty much kind of knows what those mean. So those are okay. And even still, you don't want to just because it's commonly known, you still don't want to have it littered throughout the proposal. Um, just because people know what it is, so they're familiar with it. Um, and there's no need to be repetitive. Um, if you choose to include them, define acronyms the first time they are used. That's generally the rule of thumb. If you introduce an acronym, spell it out, explain what it is, and then you can subsequently use it, the acronym after that. Um, and what you definitely don't want to do, which I've seen this happen as well, is create your own acronyms. That can be super confusing to reviewers. So try to avoid that if at all possible. Um, so here's an example of excessively long jargon. Again, the goal here is to make your proposal easily readable, easy to get through, and easy to comprehend. So and this has also been not necessarily a complaint, but a critique from our review committee when reviewing some of the proposals for our internal awards is excessively long jargon. This probably wouldn't make much sense in its current form. The excessively long example probably wouldn't make much sense to someone who is an English professor or someone who is a modern classical languages professor. I'm not saying that they aren't intelligent, but they're not familiar with that field. So writing it out as long as it is might make it extremely confusing and extremely hard for them to unpack exactly what it is you're trying to say. So instead, the easiest way to say this is, there's no cure for the common cold. That's simple enough and it's easy to understand. So you definitely want to be mindful of how you're writing your sentences. Another thing that you want to avoid, not just when you're, specifically writing for a general audience, but just in general, in any type of writing, you definitely want to avoid empty phrases because they're filler words. Um, you know, in slang terms, we call that fluff. It's a lot of fluff. So you definitely want to cut out as much of the fluff as possible, just because you want to get directly to the point. Again, I can't stress this enough. Reviewers often don't have a lot of time to allocate to proposals because they have so many to review. You want to make this process as easy for them as possible. When you use all of the empty phrases and filler words, it distracts away from the significance of your writing. So just always, always, always be mindful of that. And here's a example of commonly used empty phrases that you want to try to avoid, and use the equivalents instead, because you can see, especially like if you're writing a proposal where they are very strict and specific about the word count, you definitely want to avoid empty phrases because that takes away from your actual word count. So, and again, the key in writing for a general audience is making sure that your proposal is easy to read. You want to eliminate as many distractions as possible. So empty phrases contribute to distractions while reading your proposals. So a few best practices is you definitely want to thoroughly read through sponsor guidelines. Just, I can't stress this enough because you'd be surprised at how many people actually don't. Just based on the questions that I get regarding solicitations, a lot of times those questions can be addressed just by reading through the guidelines thoroughly. Um, you also want to read through the guidelines and the review criteria because oftentimes the review criteria pretty much gives you an outline of how the proposal should be organized. Um, Usually I tell people to use the review criteria as a way to figure out, specifically what type of headlines or subheadings you'll use throughout your proposal because it makes it easier for the reviewer to find out what they're looking for. Again, the point of writing for a general audience is making sure that your work or your proposal translate well with anyone. Like you want anyone to somebody that comes up off of the street. You want anyone to be able to understand your writing. And using subheadings that you might find in the review criteria just makes it that much more easier for reviewers. So you also want to assume that the audience is uninformed but intelligent. Again, most of these reviewers are pretty much experts in their particular field, but they might not be an expert in yours. Now, this is not to say that, if you apply to an NIH RL1, that, everyone reading the proposal or reviewing the proposal will be like an English professor. Absolutely not. Typically with NIH review committees, they're usually pretty familiar with the science surrounding the proposals that they review. But again, they might not be an exact expert. So you always, always, always want to have a colleague review your proposal. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. You know, would a colleague be able to understand your proposal? The only way to find out is to have them read it. And there's no harm in that. You don't always have to have someone who's familiar with your work read your proposal. In fact, you kind of want someone who's not familiar with your work to read your proposal because then you can gauge if the proposal's readable or if it makes sense to them. Because if it makes sense to them, then most likely it would probably make sense to the review committee. So that's a good indicator on whether or not your proposal's headed in the right direction. Another best practice is you want to use active versus passive voice. And this is because with active voice, the sentence subject performs the action. And also with active voice, the sentences are more concise, which is exactly what we want. We want to be direct and straight to the point. And it uses fewer words to express the action. Again, you're eliminating those empty phrases and filler words, as you can see in the example. Um, the active example uses less words than the passive example. And a lot of times with passive voice, it can make the sentence a tad bit confusing because there's so many extra words. So, and again, we want our proposals to be direct, to the point, and concise. So always be mindful of that. Um, again, when your proposal is near its final draft form, you want to review it and pay attention to discipline-specific terms, aka jargon. So evaluate the sentences with jargon. Evaluate whether or not they actually need to use jargon. A lot of times you can say what you're trying to say in a way simpler way. Again, you also want to check for repetition of jargon throughout the draft. Again, no one, I don't want to say no one likes it, but it makes it harder to get through a proposal that is littered with jargon. And I have been on that end before. And yeah, it distracts away from your writing every time. If every time I have to go to Google to look up what, a specific word that you've used without actually explaining what it is. So, and again, if you keep seeing jargon throughout the paper, the paper becomes not paper, the proposal becomes distracting to the reader. So just be mindful of that. Again, use jargon sparingly. A lot of times, some people will tell you not to use it at all. I slightly disagree with that because sometimes you have to use jargon to because it could be the main, a specific technical term or um, scientific condition or what have you might be the main focus of your paper. So I slightly disagree that, with people that say not to use it at all. Again, this goes back to knowing your audience, and in this case, your audience would be reviewers for the sponsor that you're applying to. So again, review the guidelines, really get a feel for what it is they're looking for, and sometimes go the extra mile, see who might be on the review committee. Not necessarily, they won't name names, but sometimes they'll give you hints as to who might review your proposal. Specifically with like private foundations, look to see who the board of directors might be. That might actually give you an idea of who your potential audience could be. So yeah, definitely um, no one wants to read a proposal that's littered with jargon. Again, I'm not saying not to use it at all, but just be mindful of how often you're using it. So here are a few writing resources that I found pretty helpful, and these will be posted on the class website under our webinars tab. But yeah, these are some really good resources to use if you're at that point in your proposal where you're writing it and you're reevaluating it to make sure that it's clear of too much jargon and that every acronym and scientific term is accurately defined. These are good resources to help you with that. Specifically this one, just because I know a lot of faculty members are used to academic writing, and sometimes it can be hard to transition from academic writing to proposal writing. So this is a really good resource to kind of help guide you through that. And so that's basically it. Does anyone have any questions?
No, I don't.
I don't either. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So yeah, thank you guys for attending. Again, my email address and everything is posted on the class website. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always willing to assist you guys. Thanks and have a great weekend.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Letitia.
Thank
Bye.
you.